Welcome to Crimes Beyond Borders, where we'll bring you the most thrilling true crime stories every single day. If you're fascinated by mystery, intrigue, and the darker side of human nature, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us as we unravel the most shocking and perplexing criminal cases from around the world. The story is about to begin after this intro.
From city streets to far-off lands, mystery slipping through our hands. Crimes beyond borders they speak, voices strong but words are meek. Every story leaves a mark, whispers softly in the dark.
Our stories at first are made for ourselves, to comfort us, to help us sleep, and to learn. Along the way, they become a part of our journey, teaching us English and fueling our passion for true crime. So, listen carefully, and if you're about to sleep, close your eyes. Let's begin. The Narvarte Massacre, a chilling tale of murder, cartels, and the silencing of voices in Mexico. On a hot summer day in July 2015, Mexico City was thrust into the international spotlight, not for the vibrant culture or historic architecture that usually defines the sprawling metropolis, but for a brutal crime that shocked the nation: the murder of 5 people, including a renowned photojournalist, in an upscale apartment in the Narvarte neighborhood. This crime, known as the Narvarte Massacre, was not only horrific in its brutality, but also raised deeply troubling questions about the state of press freedom, cartel violence, and government corruption in Mexico. The victims' brutal deaths became a symbol of the dangers faced by journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens in a country where violence and impunity often go hand in hand. The murders exposed the terrifying reach of drug cartels, the vulnerability of those who dared to speak out, and the pervasive corruption that undermines Mexico's justice system. Years later, the case remains unresolved, with the families of the victims continuing to seek justice in a climate where the powerful forces behind the killings still loom large. The victims: a journalist, an activist, and 3 others. The story begins with Ruben Espinosa, a photojournalist whose images of political protests, human rights abuses, and the violence in Veracruz, one of Mexico's most dangerous states, had earned him national recognition. Ruben worked for Proceso, one of Mexico's leading investigative magazines, as well as Cuarto Oscuro, a photography agency. In the months leading up to his death, Ruben had begun receiving threats related to his work, particularly after covering protests and exposing abuses linked to the government of Veracruz's governor, Javier Duarte, a man who would later become infamous for his corrupt ties to drug cartels. Fearing for his life, Ruben fled Veracruz in June 2015, seeking safety in Mexico City. But the capital, often seen as a refuge for those escaping cartel violence in other regions, would prove to be just as dangerous. Ruben's murder, alongside 4 others, would send a chilling message that even in the heart of the nation, there was no escape from the long reach of violence. Alongside Ruben were 4 women who were also brutally murdered. Nadia Vera, a human rights activist and cultural promoter from Veracruz, who, like Ruben, had fled to Mexico City after receiving threats related to her work. Yesenia Quiroz, a young makeup artist, who was renting a room in the same apartment. Alejandra Negrete, a housekeeper, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mile Virginia Martin, a Colombian national and friend of Yesenia, whose presence in Mexico raised questions about potential ties to the drug trade, a theory that the authorities would later exploit. The 5 victims, who had little in common apart from their association with Ruben and Nadia, were found dead in a gruesome scene. All had been tortured and shot execution style, with the women showing signs of sexual violence. The apartment was ransacked, and the sheer brutality of the killings suggested a level of organization and ruthlessness that pointed to something far beyond a simple robbery. The crime scene: a brutal display of power. On July 31, 2015, the bodies were discovered in an apartment in the Narvarte neighborhood. a middle-class district of Mexico City. Ruben, Nadia, Yesenia, Alejandra, and Mile were found bound, gagged, and executed. The victims had been shot in the head, and the women had been raped. The crime scene was one of sheer brutality, indicating not only an intention to kill, but to send a message. The discovery of Ruben Espinosa's body immediately sent shockwaves through the journalistic community in Mexico and beyond. As a photojournalist known for his critical work on political corruption and human rights abuses, his murder became a symbol of the extreme dangers faced by those who dared to expose the powerful. Nadia Vera's murder added another layer of complexity to the case. A prominent human rights activist, Nadia had been outspoken in her criticisms of the Veracruz government, particularly Governor Duarte's regime, which had been linked to multiple cases of violence against journalists and activists. In fact, before her death, Nadia had publicly stated that if anything were to happen to her, Duarte and his government would be responsible. Her chilling premonition now seemed to have come true. Despite the initial focus on Ruben and Nadia's political activism, the authorities quickly shifted the narrative. They suggested that the murders might have been the result of a robbery gone wrong, or, more disturbingly, an act linked to drug cartels. The presence of Mile Virginia, a Colombian national, gave them an opportunity to claim that the killings could have been related to narco-trafficking, an explanation that diverted attention away from the possibility of a politically motivated crime. Theories and investigations. The struggle for truth. From the beginning, the investigation into the Narvarte massacre was marred by controversy, incompetence, and what many saw as an intentional effort to obscure the truth. Mexican authorities, notorious for their mishandling of high-profile cases, immediately came under fire for their slow and inadequate response to the crime. One of the first theories pushed by the authorities was that the murders were linked to organized crime. They pointed to Mile Virginia Martin's Colombian nationality as a potential indicator of involvement in drug trafficking, implying that the murders could have been carried out by cartel hitmen. This narrative, however, was seen by many as an attempt to discredit the victims, particularly Ruben and Nadia, by suggesting they were somehow connected to illicit activities. Another theory suggested that the killings were a botched robbery. Authorities claimed that the apartment had been ransacked and that items of value had been stolen. However, this explanation failed to account for the level of violence inflicted on the victims, particularly the sexual assault and torture, which indicated a far more sinister motive. Many of Ruben Espinosa's colleagues, as well as human rights groups, quickly rejected these theories. They pointed to the Veracruz connection, noting that both Ruben and Nadia had fled the state due to threats related to their work. Veracruz had gained a reputation as one of the most dangerous places for journalists and activists in Mexico, with multiple unsolved murders and disappearances linked to Governor Javier Duarte's regime. Javier Duarte, a member of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, had been at the center of numerous scandals involving corruption, violence, and ties to drug cartels. Under his governorship, Veracruz had become notorious for its crackdown on dissent, with several journalists mysteriously disappearing or turning up dead after publishing critical reports of the government. Given Ruben's coverage of political protests and human rights abuses in Veracruz, many believed that the massacre had been ordered to silence him and send a chilling message to other journalists and activists. Similarly, Nadia Vera's outspoken criticism of the Veracruz government and her public warnings that she was in danger added further weight to the theory that this was a politically motivated crime. Arrests and allegations of a cover-up. In the weeks following the murders, authorities arrested 3 suspects: Daniel Pacheco, a former police officer, and 2 other men, Abraham Torres and Omar Martinez, who were reportedly involved in organized crime. The official narrative presented by the government was that the 3 men had entered the apartment to rob it and in the process had murdered the 5 victims. Pacheco admitted to being at the scene, but denied participating in the killings, claiming he had been forced to cooperate by other unknown individuals. Despite these arrests, many questions remained unanswered, and there were widespread allegations of a cover-up. Rubén Espinosa's colleagues, human rights organizations, and the victims' families accused the government of deliberately mishandling the case to protect powerful interests, particularly those connected to the Veracruz government and its links to drug cartels. Several pieces of evidence pointed to serious flaws in the investigation. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex showed the suspects leaving the building in a car that had previously been linked to Veracruz officials. Additionally, there were allegations that key evidence had been tampered with or destroyed, and witnesses reported being threatened to remain silent. One of the most damning accusations came from the families of the victims, who claimed that the authorities had neglected to thoroughly investigate the political motives behind the killings. They argued that by focusing on theories of robbery or drug-related violence, the government was attempting to shift attention away from the possibility that the massacre had been orchestrated to silence dissenting voices. The broader context: journalists and activists in Mexico. The Narvarte massacre is not an isolated case, but rather part of a broader pattern of violence against journalists, human rights defenders, and activists in Mexico. Since the start of Mexico's war on drugs in 2006, the country has become one of the most dangerous places in the world for those who dare to speak out against corruption, organized crime, and human rights abuses. Journalists in particular have been targeted by both drug cartels and corrupt politicians. In many cases, journalists who report on cartel activities or government corruption are subjected to threats, intimidation, and violence. According to Reporters Without Borders, more than 100 journalists have been murdered in Mexico since 2000, with most of these crimes remaining unsolved. Veracruz, the state from which Rubén Espinosa and Nadia Vera fled, has been one of the deadliest regions for journalists. During Javier Duarte's governorship, 2010 to 2016, at least 17 journalists were murdered, with many more disappearing without a trace. Despite this, there have been few convictions, and impunity for crimes against journalists remains the norm. The Narvarte massacre highlighted the extreme vulnerability of journalists and activists in Mexico, who face constant threats to their lives for simply doing their jobs. It also underscored the broader issue of impunity, as the powerful, whether they be cartel leaders or government officials, often escape justice, while their victims and their families are left to suffer in silence. The struggle for justice, a continuing fight. In the years following the Narvarte massacre, the families of the victims have continued to demand justice, despite facing numerous obstacles. The case has moved slowly through Mexico's overburdened and often corrupt legal system, with little progress made in identifying the true masterminds behind the killings. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Article 19, have repeatedly called for a more thorough investigation into the political motives behind the massacre, arguing that the current suspects are merely scapegoats. However, the government has resisted these efforts, and the case remains shrouded in mystery. In 2016, Javier Duarte fled Mexico after facing multiple charges of corruption and organized crime. He was eventually captured in Guatemala in 2017 and extradited back to Mexico, where he was convicted of embezzling millions of dollars from public funds. While his conviction was seen as a victory for anti-corruption efforts, the broader network of violence and impunity that he oversaw in Veracruz, including the murders of journalists and activists, has yet to be fully addressed. For the families of Rubén Espinosa, Nadia Vera, and the other victims, the fight for justice continues. They have vowed not to let the memory of their loved ones be forgotten, and to keep pushing for accountability in a country where those who speak out often pay the ultimate price. Conclusion: a symbol of a broken system. The Narvarte massacre is a symbol of the dark and deadly forces that continue to plague Mexico. Drug cartels, corruption, impunity, and violence against those who dare to speak out. The murder of Rubén Espinosa, a brave journalist, and Nadia Vera, a fearless activist, represents the silencing of voices that sought to expose the truth in a country where telling the truth can be a death sentence. The massacre is a stark reminder of the dangers faced by journalists and human rights defenders in Mexico, as well as the limits to which those in power seek it out, you must tread carefully, for they may never live to tell the tale. The story has come to an end, but stay relaxed. If you feel yourself drifting off to sleep, just let the video play and enjoy the soothing music in the background. Let it guide you gently into rest. We'll be here, bringing you more stories every night. Sleep well, and see you tomorrow at 8 p.m.